You've got this line in the report which says Hamas turned tactical defeat into strategic influence.
Essentially, the more Hamas fighters were killed, the more names they could add to their fatality list, and then that number was then used to beat Israel with a stick. It's the only war in recent history where the fatality number has been the thing that people have decided good or bad. But one thing that really struck me actually is that, the tunnels is fascinating. They're not just like mono-level. They go really deep underground, they cross over each other, they interlap, they intersect. It's been called the city of jihad.
They could have fitted all of Gaza's civilians into the tunnels to be safe from bombardment if that was their purpose. But instead, they placed the tunnels under civilian centres and then didn't allow civilians into the tunnels.
Like there were so many, as many as 100,000 IEDs in Gaza. And if we look at the surface area of the Gaza Strip, that means there's an IED as a minimum, on average, every 60 feet. You can't stop and defuse it. So you've got two options. You either just don't go there or you make it go bang safely.
Medical lessons from the IDF. Let's spend a little bit of time on that.
So what you've got in Gaza is soldiers getting more injured, but more of them are surviving. And the reason is tenfold. The first one is...
Well, perhaps let's finish by talking about what the IDF hasn't done well.
Is the IDF perfect? Of course not. It's unrealistic to think that they would be, but the point is they've done a lot very well, and there are tons we can take away from it.
Is there also criticism about the overuse of force at any point? Hello, and thank you for joining us on The Brink. I'm Jake Wallace-Simons.
And I'm Andrew Fox.
Now, this week, I'm interviewing Andrew on his groundbreaking new report, Tactical Lessons from Gaza. The report is the first of its kind and has been praised by extremely senior military leaders from around the world. Today, we're going to dig into the details, looking at everything from Israeli innovation in combined arms maneuvers and battlefield medical care to the awful effectiveness of the Hamas human shield and propaganda strategy, and what next time we can do about it.
If you're enjoying our podcast, don't forget to like, subscribe, share it, and leave a comment, because we love to know what you think. If you're listening on audio, please do give the podcast 5 stars. And if you're still hitting that irritating paywall, now would be a great time to subscribe.
And now, without further ado, we present your own Andrew Fox on The Brink. Well, Andrew, thank you for joining us on The Brink.
Well, yeah, I'm the one being interviewed now.
You are.
It's
I'm
in the hot seat.
Yeah, exactly, and for good reason, because your new report, Tactical Lessons from Gaza, which you produced for the Henry Jackson Society, has been hugely praised by other military experts and leaders around the world, isn't it?
Yeah, so I've had great feedback from Canada, Australia, 4 stars from the United States of America, which is great.
4 stars.
4-star generals.
Right.
Yeah,
okay.
so,
Even like 4 stars out of 5. I was like, where's the other star?
Yeah,
so 4-star generals.
5 stars is what people should give the Brink.
Right.
4-star is a military rank.
Exactly.
So yeah, I was really humbled by some of the praise that came in. And there's one particular academic, Charles Knight, who called it seminal, which is pretty high compliment from pretty much the best academic in the world in his field.
Yeah.
I'll take that all day long.
Yeah, great. And partly it's because of the methodology that you use, isn't it? Because the Gaza war is nothing if not politicized. It's probably the most politicized conflict in human history. Everyone's seeing what they want to see, finding what they want to find to support their existing arguments. But you went about it in a different way, didn't you?
I did. And look, I'll go hard to start with and say this is not criticism of the IDF, because they have their position that they want to represent, and that's completely natural and understandable, and what any other military would do. But I think pretty much every kind of, let's term them pro-Israel analyst, gets a line from the IDF, repeats it without verification, and then analyses what they've been told. I wasn't really happy with that, because you can always sense there's stuff you're not being told. You can always sense there's a kind of line to take, and that's fine, but it's not academic. And so what I did was spent 2 years essentially kind of recruiting a network of soldiers who would talk to me. And that comes from my military background. It comes from my background as a paratrooper who has dabbled in the SF world. And when these soldiers told me their accounts, I would then go away and cross-check them against each other. I'd go and look at open source intelligence to try and verify. There's incredible stuff you can do on open source maps, even down to like spotting units moving in location A on date B. And I think the result on what I hope is that it's a unique paper
Yeah.
because it's got that verification that a lot of people don't have. And then on top of that, I'm very happy to criticize where criticism's due. And I think that is lacking from a lot of analysis on the sort of pro-Israel side, where it's pom-poms and miniskirts and cheerleading,
Yeah.
which I don't think is really helpful because it lacks credibility. And so what I aim for is a credible paper, verified, academically robust, and fair, most of all.
I mean, the interesting thing is about you, if I may say so, is that you've always treated the IDF and the war in Gaza as you would any other war, fairly, criticising where criticism is due, praising where praise is due, and observing all the complexities and challenges and difficulties and more grey areas and all the rest of it. And yet that neutral, fair perspective has made you seem like an Israel cheerleader, because the weight of the world is so against Israel that somebody who is scrupulously fair and down the line looks like an Israel cheerleader because everyone else is so anti.
Yeah, of course. And look, I'm not going to mince my words. I'm a Zionist. I believe in the existence of the state of Israel. I believe in, that post World War II, it was broadly in the sense of not the way it was executed, but certainly in concept, it was the right thing to do. And yes, it was a bit messy at the start, if we're honest. And I don't think any fair commentator would disagree with that. But when it comes to 2025, 26, I am a Zionist and I come at it from that perspective, which means I'm not interested in the whole colonizer, settler nonsense. And so I just say, look, here's a war happening. It's my job to look at wars. I treat this war as I would a war involving America or the UK or Ukraine or Australia or Papua New Guinea, and that's the approach I take. What do I think is good? What do I think is, worthy of improvement? And I analyze it correspondingly.
Yeah. But I mean, even the word Zionist has become so weaponized. Actually, it should, or maybe even does, represent the sensible position that's held by the majority. I think a lot of people, if you said to them, are you a Zionist? They'll say no. But if you say, do you think that Israel should exist and should have a right to exist? And they would say yes.
Yeah.
Which means that they are a Zionist. But the definition of Zionist has been weaponized and twisted so much. So
look, and that's anti-Semitic in and of itself.
Yeah.
We don't ask, there are innumerable countries around the world that have had their borders drawn post 1945. Like, this isn't unusual or different to a whole variety of countries on every continent.
Yeah.
And yet the Jewish state is singled out for this singular praise. And I think that's where I'm trying to, with my academic work, where I'm trying to draw that line and say, look, let's stop treating Israel differently. Let's just treat it like every other country and analyze it on those terms.
Yeah.
And that gives us a much fairer, more balanced, and more sensible perspective.
Yeah. I mean, historically, Israel's completely typical of what was happening at the time. New countries being created by the Allied powers, whether it's Lebanon and Syria, whether it's Iraq, or other countries, Jordan, being drawn by lines on the map by Britain and France largely. Israel was the same. Every country coming into existence with mass population expulsions, bloodshed, ethnic rivalry. Israel totally standard for all of that. The only difference, as you say, was that it's Jewish and had immigration from Europe. But
look, if Israel doesn't have a right to exist, then neither does Jordan.
Yeah,
it's the same beast.
Yeah,
it's called Transjordan for a reason.
Yeah.
And that point seems to miss most people completely.
Yeah, I mean, Jordan with a Hashemite minority ruling over a Palestinian majority is perhaps even more questionable. But let's not get too sidetracked from the report. It's brilliant, and we want to get into the weeds of it. So where should we start? So you've got three main categories. The first category, strategic level lessons, which boil down to civilian protection and legitimacy first and foremost. This really is the heart of the Gaza conflict, isn't it? What sets it aside from other conflicts and makes it globally encompassing in a way.
I think so, only because it's become the headline.
Yeah.
It's the only war in recent history where the casualty number or the fatality number has been the thing that people have decided good or bad based on that number. And I think it's worth just taking a very, very brief step back and a segue and just talking about strategic, operational, tactical, because these are niche terms. Most people watching this haven't been to staff college. So let's just define our terminology. Strategic, we're talking about ends. Like, what are you trying to achieve when you get to the end of the conflict? Operational is how you coordinate tactical actions to achieve the strategic goal. So there's a big debate whether operational and tactical are the same thing, but actually operational is where what Field Marshal Slim in Defeat into Victory, his book, the incredible book that he wrote after World War II, described as the full orchestra of war. How do you get all the instruments singing together on the same sheet and coordinate that to achieve the end state that you're trying to achieve? And when we talk about fatalities being strategic, what we mean is there is an end state that Hamas were trying to achieve by weaponizing the number of fatalities in Gaza.
Yeah.
So we're talking about ends at this point. And look, there's no other war in history where that has been the defining factor as to whether good or bad. And it doesn't matter that you unpack that casualty figure. And, I can plug my other Henry Jackson Society paper here called Questionable Counting, which was the first paper that ripped apart the Hamas casualty stats and was verified by Hamas themselves. Because I said it's full of errors. And then 3 months later, they said, yes, we agree, and deleted as many as 5,000 names from that list. So, in terms of academic validation, it doesn't get much better. But it's really important stuff. And go on Wikipedia. Anyone watching this, go on Wikipedia and Google casualties in Afghanistan. You will get 100,000 error of difference. It's between 100 and 200,000. That's how vague it is in most wars. Look at Iran going on as we speak. The casualty figures range from sort of 2,500, if you believe the regime, to 20,000 to the most estimates. And some people are talking about even more than that. Like, that's how vague this normally is. Yeah, in Gaza, you get it to the number on a daily basis. And that tells you all you need to know.
Yeah. And so you've got this line in the report in this section which says Hamas turned tactical defeat into strategic influence. Which is a great line and sums it up, that for them, a defeat on the battlefield was a propaganda victory. And the harder they were defeated, the bigger they'd win with the aid of the media, NGOs, the UN, hostile actors on social media, et cetera, et cetera. And I suppose what they were going for was to convince the world that Israel was not fighting Hamas, but was fighting Gazan civilians and committing a genocide. That's where it all went, isn't it?
Yeah, and so when we say tactical defeat, that means essentially the more Hamas fighters were killed, and then the collateral damage that will unfortunately naturally come with that in any war, the more names they could add to their fatality list, and then that number was then used to beat Israel with a stick. But one thing that really struck me actually is that the IDF soldiers I interviewed, time and time and time again, they repeated that they were fighting in ghost towns. The areas where the fighting happened were almost entirely evacuated. Less, actually, interestingly, the elderly and the really young. They were the two groups that were generally left behind. But if you
much for women and children first.
Exactly. But actually, then again, you look at the fatality list and the fewest casualties are in the really young and the really old age groups. Oh. It's a pretty good bell curve. So it shows that even though that's the groups that were in the fighting zones, they were the least killed, which is a pretty good indicator that the IDF were taking care of them and not, just indiscriminately smashing everything in front of them. But yeah, these areas were mostly empty, which shows IDF evacuation requests or demands, if you will, were effective. And look, that's why there were so many people in Al-Mawasi humanitarian zone, which isn't great. It's not a nice place to be. But it's better than being dead.
Yeah. And we saw, no genocide is carried out with advance warning to evacuate. No genocide is carried out with polio vaccinations to prevent people from dying and spreading that disease, or with all the aid, which in itself is a controversial area. But the aid provision, no one would deny that Israel was engaged with allowing a lot of aid into Gaza. Those aren't the markers of any kind of recognizable genocide, and yet that was Hamas's genius, was that it turned civilian casualties into the definition of the war with the aid of everyone from the ICJ, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, which, as we know, what was it? It cost £3 to join or something, or was that the latest?
Yeah, anyone could join. They looked at people they knew had joined, like huge amounts of Iraqis had joined, and yeah, it's
someone called Adolf Hitler joined, I think.
I believe so. Yeah, people were signing their dog up for it. This is not a credible academic organisation. But and
then the UN, the media,
Well, as with the Lemkin Institute, it's nothing to do with Lemkin. It's a political activist group, but because they've called themselves the Lemkin Institute, their word carries far more weight than it ought to.
Right.
Likewise, if you call yourself the IAGS, the International Association of Genocide Scholars, all of a sudden that has weight. And it's a complete sleight of hand.
Yeah.
And we've seen this just time and time and time again.
Yeah. And I suppose the two questions that come out of this for me, well, there are three areas to talk about. One is about the tunnels and the human shields and the role of combat engineering. Maybe we'll look at that first, because that's squarely in your report as lessons that the West can learn, Western armies can learn from Gaza. Tell me about that.
I mean, the tunnels is fascinating. We initially thought there were as many as 500 miles. Later reports suggest as many as 1,000. Even 500 is longer than the entirety of the London Underground. This is incredible. And one thing that I think a lot of people don't realize is they're not just like mono-level. They go really deep underground, they cross over each other, they interlap, they intersect. Like this is, it's been called the city of jihad. And it is an underground city with living accommodation, with offices, with weapons manufacturing depots, arms stores, ventilation, fire suppression systems in some cases. This is actually a genuinely remarkable engineering feat by Hamas. And even in the area of Gaza now that the IDF holds, they're still finding new tunnels on a daily basis. And that explains so much of the damage, because we've all been horrified by the images of Gaza. Like, I've been to Gaza and I was horrified by the damage. But when you look at how they weaponize that whole landscape with the tunnels underneath, look, you want to destroy a tunnel, you're going to destroy the stuff above it. And the only thing you could otherwise not do is just not destroy the tunnels. And obviously that's not really an option. So this is just a natural corollary to Hamas's defensive tactics. The IDF offensive tactics match it.
And so talk to me, because we were in Israel together about a year ago or so.
Yeah, they wouldn't let you in anywhere.
Yeah, they wouldn't let me in anywhere. Apart from one, there was one particular briefing that I was allowed into about the tunnels from what
General Golfus.
It was, yeah. Although I think it was off the record, but it's now just been put on the record. But I guess it was a year ago, so that's all right. And he's been moved since. So.
It's all right. He's cited in the report anyway, so right. I've already blown that out of the water.
Perfect. But that was an extraordinary briefing. It basically described how the IDF had initially been caught short by the tunnels, clearing an area of ground above ground, then moving on only for Hamas to reappear in the area that they cleared because there were tunnels they hadn't targeted, but then using a combined arms strategy and sending men underground to fight the enemy, and using a kind of combined tactical approach to flush out Hamas and kill them. I mean, I just came away thinking, if I was a 19-year-old conscript and I was being told to go into a tunnel that was, you've got to stoop in the tunnels, haven't you? So it's less than whatever it is, it's 5'5" or something.
Yeah. I mean, I was in the tunnels. They are far lower than me. Yeah. And actually, I'm a pretty wide guy, but my shoulders were brushing each side as I walked down.
Yeah, and if you were going down there into the dark, they have dogs, but even with dogs into the unknown, with the possibility of hostile fire coming at you with no cover, I mean, that's absolutely terrifying. And just the sheer bravery of these kids to go down and do that.
Yeah, and there's been a real adaptation throughout the war. And that's kind of, if we're looking at the meta theme for the whole paper, it's the fact that the IDF adapted so well, because 7th of October, they weren't ready in any respect, logistically, in terms of the kit for that many reserves. Even the reserve call-up paperwork wasn't ready. And they certainly weren't ready to maneuver simultaneously subterranean and above ground. Like none of that was in place. And they even invented a new headquarters halfway through the war to coordinate those underground operations better. And they actually moved to a place where it was only special forces went underground. So you had units like Yahalom, which is the tunnel commandos, Shaldag, Shaitet 13, these are tier 1 special forces units, and they're the ones that now go underground.
Right.
Because it just wasn't safe or particularly effective to send your conventional recruits or conventional troops into those spaces. And, I spoke to a captain from Yahalom just 2 weeks ago, and he was saying approximately every 100 yards underground, they would find an obstacle, be that a steel door, be it an improvised explosive device, be it just sandbags. every 100 yards, you'd find that obstacle. And the way they're doing it now is they are moving silently. They're using thermal imaging. They're doing it, completely by hand signals underground, and they are very, very fast and effective in doing that now. But they're still finding tunnels all the time. Hamas are still digging new tunnels. Even on the yellow line, they're still finding Hamas suddenly pop up and have a go at them. So the tunnel system, and I think this is key. It's not going to be the same for us when we go to war.
Yeah.
We're very unlikely to see that, but there are techniques, tactics, procedures that the IDF have developed that we could absolutely use. And I know for a fact there are British Army units, or should I say joint force units, that they are now coming over to the UK briefing on this stuff because they are the global leaders and nobody else comes close in this stuff.
And the reason why, in my mind, this comes under the banner of the civilian casualties but exploitation, manipulation that Hamas used, is that the tunnels were part of that, really, weren't they? Because the tunnels, they could have fitted all of Gaza's civilians into the tunnels to be safe from bombardment if that was their purpose. But instead, they placed the tunnels under civilian targets or civilian centres, and then didn't allow civilians into the tunnels, with the shafts coming out into schools, mosques, we know the rest, hospitals and so on. So in a way, it was part of the human shield strategy, wasn't it? That was integral to Hamas's construction of the tunnels as their centre of gravity.
Yeah, and look at how many tunnel shafts they were, 57,000 at the last estimate, probably more.
Yeah.
Almost all of them, certainly from late Khan Yunis operation down into the Rafah operation, almost all of them were mined, IED, booby traps, whatever you want to call it. That is going to cause, by definition, a huge amount of destruction. Like there were so many, as many as 100,000 IEDs in Gaza. And if we look at the surface area of the Gaza Strip, that means there's an IED as a minimum, on average, every 60 feet. Actually, that's denser in urban areas. Obviously, the rural areas less so. So, greater than every 60 feet, you find something that goes bang. You can't stop and defuse it. So you've got two options. You either just don't go there or you make it go bang safely. And the IDF obviously chose the other option, to make it go bang. And that's why you see whole areas like Rafah completely ruined. Because A, they're detonating IEDs, and B, they're carving, using the bulldozers, alternative routes that aren't IED.
Yeah.
And this isn't unusual. Yeah, we did that in Sangin. The Americans did that.
With bulldozers, you mean?
Not with bulldozers. We actually mouseholed our way through using explosives, but it's the same principle.
In Iraq?
Afghanistan.
In Afghanistan.
Yeah, it's Northern Helmand. Sangin was the worst area to be in Afghanistan. And so if you had a whole street that you knew was IED'd, you just blow your way through buildings to get to where you need to go. That's just standard stuff.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And it's not unusual to the IDF, but they just had to do it on a scale that was unprecedented because the whole damn place was IED'd.
And there were 57,000 shafts. Well, I think it's fair to say that Hamas shafted Gaza in more way than one.
Very good.
I was building up to that. So that's that. And so combat engineering lessons from there that can be used by NATO forces, you think?
Yeah, in urban settings. Look, we have vehicles that are way better for kind of engineering breaching operations than a D9 bulldozer. A D9 bulldozer is just a bulldozer, but up-armoured and in some cases remote controlled.
Which is what the Israelis used.
Exactly that. We have Royal Engineer vehicles that are vastly more capable.
Just got two of them, that's all. That's
exactly, but they're vastly more technologically advanced and more expensive.
Yeah.
And actually, do you need, we're in an era now where technological advances are outpacing defence procurement timelines. So we look how long in the British Army it took us to bring the Ajax vehicle into operation, like 10 years, and it's still a rattling vomit trap that ruins soldiers' hearing. We don't have time to have 10-year procurement cycles anymore. If we want a new engineering vehicle in 2036, we need to start today. We're actually, if you just buy a ton of bulldozers, up-armour them, stick a robot remote controller in there, all of a sudden you've got a very effective breaching bit of kit.
And that's what the Israelis were doing.
They have done that, exactly. And we look at Ukraine as well, where, there are technological innovations that are happening in schools and classrooms in the sense that they just commandeer a classroom in a school and that's now a drone production factory. And they're churning out 10,000 drones a month at a cost of $500 a drone. And yet we're still here looking at incredibly boutique, high-tech equipment that takes years to procure, costs billions of pounds, and isn't ready in the timelines that we're going to need. So the lesson from those D9s is not necessarily the way they were used, because we do similar things, but it's the fact they're cheap, mass-produced, and ready to go today.
Yeah.
Which is very different to that long boutique experience.
I mean, in Ukraine, it's interesting because when you think about technological innovation, particularly drones, you first think of Ukraine these days. You think of the Russian drones with those millions of silken threads that run because they don't want to Bluetooth the drones or whatever. It's more reliable to have an actual physical line. And so the drone blows up, and then you're left with these extraordinarily wispy threads all over the battlefield. You think of that. You think of, I mean, there was a thing in the paper the other day about Russian tanks called the dandelions, with a sort of structure on top of them so that drones can't get close enough to explode. That sort of just low-tech, practical innovation on both sides, and people piloting drones with VR goggles on and so on. You don't really think about the Gaza theatre of war for drone innovation, for technological innovation in the same lo-fi way. But you're saying in your report there's a drone and counter-drone lessons that we can learn from Gaza as well.
Yeah, I think so. The congested space is a really good lesson, because if you have a ton of remote control things in the air, that's an awful lot of electromagnetic spectrum getting saturated. And that can cause real dramas with actually controlling your drones. We are already, I think, doing a lot of the stuff the IDF does. So having things like throw drones, where you can just lob it over the other side of a wall and it gives you the camera feedback, or the small fingernail size stuff that can zip around and do the sneaky beaky. That's not especially new. The critical point is, I think the Israelis didn't have enough of them, and they learned very quickly that they were such a battlefield enhancer, they needed them. And you actually found troops charity fundraising to buy drones for the reserve units that perhaps weren't in the priority line to get drones, but their use has been unquestionably kind of validated by this conflict. And look, this report is not designed to give you new lessons all the time. In many ways, there are some of those, but also current stuff. It's just good to have confirmation, as well as age-old techniques like using field telephones or smoke to signal, or even hygiene in the field. We get so excited about looking at the future of warfare and drone swarms that actually we forget that if soldiers aren't washing properly, they're going to go down with disease, and that takes your combat effectiveness out of the question. So I've tried to look across the spectrum here as old lessons that go back to the trenches of World War I, all the way through to stuff we already know, but it's good to have validated, through to things that might be really useful in the future.
Yeah, and you were talking about in your report how the IDF had a backup for tech. So they had coloured flares with an agreed table of signals. They had, like you say, old-fashioned wired telephones and other things that when your comms goes down, if and when your comms goes down, you can still cope by going back 100 years or 50 years and communicating the old-fashioned way, which is something I think that people can overlook in this brave new world of tech.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the tunnels are a great example, because what they try and do is they use the American Embeds radio, which is, I've used it. It's probably better than the British Bowman, if I'm honest. It's much smaller, it's much more compact, and it's battle tested from Afghanistan to Iraq and onwards. Essentially what they're doing is zip tying them to the walls of the tunnel and creating a rebroadcast network.
Right.
Turns out that's not hugely effective. It went down all the time. So they were literally using wired comms to communicate, which, if you go back to read, Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves, that's exactly what they did in World War I. So these lessons, I think, are timeless, but it's always really good to have confirmation that they're still valid.
Yeah, a lot of tunnel warfare in World War I,
of course. Yeah.
So that's the tunnels and combat engineering side of things. The other two questions I had with regard to the civilian casualty side of things is, number one, what, in your analysis, in your report, could Israel have done to mitigate the tsunami of condemnation engineered by Hamas, Qatar, Turkey, Iran, China, Russia, and their friends in the UN, media, etc.? What could Israel have done better to stop that from breaking all over it?
I mean, very little. And, the changes they make, I think, are very much general hindsight, because you have to remember where Israel was on 8th of October 2023. Utterly rocked, on the back foot. There are still Hamas terrorists running around inside the borders of Israel. They know they're going to have to conduct a counterattack or, I guess, an invasion, if you want to call it that. Frankly, they were not thinking about what people on X or TikTok were saying. And I can understand that. In hindsight, it was very damaging not to have that plan in place. But look, you can't blame them too hard for having their heads in a slightly different space at that point.
They should be trying not to be killed.
Yeah, with 1,200 Israelis lying dead, raped and mutilated on the floor. The last thing you're thinking about is your social media strategy.
Yeah.
So, we can be quite kind to Israel on that one. The unfortunate corollary from that is that they lost the narrative. And once you've lost the narrative, I think that's the great lesson, is that once the narrative is set, you ain't changing it. Like, look at my casualty stats paper, like completely validated by Hamas themselves. And, it did really well on social media, did really well on sort of global media, but did it shift the narrative? No, it didn't. Because it would require Sky News and the BBC to take a step back and admit they'd been negligent as journalists, frankly, for the preceding 13, 14 months. It's just not going to happen. And I think that's the lesson, is that you need to get ahead of this stuff. And look, if we go to war in Eastern Europe, as I say NATO, perhaps that's ill-advisable, as a composite of European nations, if we go to war in Eastern Europe, it's not going to come at us like 7th of October.
Yeah.
Like, we know it's coming. And we can almost get our narratives in the bag now just by doing a threat assessment. We can start seeding that. And, we have to be clever in how we do this stuff. And people, there's a brilliant conspiracy theory on the internet. It's my favorite, about 77th Brigade, which is brilliant because that's not what you call it. It's 77 Brigade. So nobody calls it 77th, but apparently it's this British Army nudge unit that's there to sort of prepare the ground for the globalists or something. It's mad and it's very funny. But actually, we do have a unit in the British Army that does do this stuff, and it is 77 Brigade. So there are narratives now that we can get ahead of and start preparing people. And it's not to deceive people, and it's not to kind of persuade people that we need to go to war. But the point is, war might come. And you can guarantee, just looking at how Russia's operated in Ukraine, that if they do go to war with us, we are going to see a savage attack on our own population through the information space. Like, you are the aggressors, you are killing innocent civilians wherever it is you're fighting. Russia didn't want this. This is all your fault. And we're seeing that. We know NATO expansion is what caused the war in Ukraine. Like, by any metric, that is ludicrous. And, shame on Nigel Farage for repeating that actually quite recently.
Just before the election, wasn't it?
Yeah, exactly. I think he said it again recently. This is direct Kremlin propaganda that has crept into the mainstream narrative. So we know it's coming. And there are things we can do now to get ahead of it so that we're not in the position that the Israelis were in on 8th of October 2023.
Yeah, and you've got people like Tucker Carlson who basically parrots exactly Kremlin lines, almost word for word, and is in the White House frequently influencing Trump to break the Republican Party away from Israel, away from Ukraine, and all the things that matter. Which brings me to my other point, actually, which is whether the Hamas tactics of sacrificing civilians for the purpose of propaganda, whether that has incentivized or potentially incentivized other hostile actors to do the same, or whether it's a unique quality of their fight against Israel because of how the world sees Israel anyway.
I think the bigger lesson is that to get a strategic win at that level, you can attack your opponent's casus belli, cause for war.
Yeah.
And you can do it through casualty stats, obviously.
So people forget the reasons that Israel went to war, which was October the 7th, and to kill Hamas, and they suddenly think the reason is to kill civilians.
Yeah, basically. Or to commit genocide. There's no question that there would be no war in Gaza if Gaza hadn't attacked Israel.
Yeah.
And yet the narrative of that is completely flipped on its head in the world sphere. And it's the same, with Ukraine, and we're seeing a variation of it from the Russians, blaming NATO for expansion eastwards, even though Ukraine is not a NATO member. And frankly, before the war was never looking likely to be, for a variety of reasons. And yet they've laser-focused Russian propaganda onto the MAGA voter base. And in doing so, they've actually generated that political pressure. And it turns out got its way all the way to the White House. And you frequently hear Trump administration officials directly parroting Kremlin propaganda, like, as well as allied journalists, as you mentioned with Tucker Carlson. But the lesson not necessarily is that casualties will be weaponized, but something will be. And that's what you have to be ready for. You have to look at what you're doing and say, okay, if I'm the other side, which elements of this reason for going to war am I going to focus on and try and undermine popular support? Because if you can undermine popular support, then you take away one of the legs of Clausewitz's Trinity, which goes right back to the origins of war studies theory. And that is that you need the government, the people, and the army. It's a bit more complicated than that, but my war studies friends are going to tell me off for the way I phrase that. But the bottom line is, if you pull away one of the legs of that stool, you undermine the entire process of the war. And that's what they're trying to do with information warfare.
Yeah, so with Hamas, it was civilian casualty statistics to try to convince people that it was a genocide, not a war.
Mm-hmm.
But in the case of Russia, it could be something else. NATO expansion could be the misinformation target or something else.
Yeah, or with China, it could be that Taiwan is somehow a breakaway state that has always belonged to China. It could be along those lines, but you're going to see that pattern repeated.
And let's talk briefly about the fact that journalists weren't allowed into Gaza. Now, I think back to previous conflicts in Gaza when journalists were allowed in, and the 2014 conflict, for example, journalists were there. I've got friends who were there. It was before I was on the road myself, so I wasn't there during that time. But all journalists were provided with a Hamas minder, taken to see only things that were beneficial to Hamas propaganda. So you think the propaganda without journalists in there has been bad. Imagine journalists on the ground with their cameras and with their crew, with a Hamas minder, being taken to hospital A, hospital B, place A, place B, only civilian casualties, no sign of a dead or wounded combatant at all. And I think back to 2014 in particular, because there's one story that sticks in my mind, which was, I don't know if you remember this, there was an Indian film crew.
Yes.
Who in a hotel, and they noticed some movement outside their hotel window, and it was a couple of Hamas fighters, terrorists, launching a rocket. And they'd never seen this before because they'd been kept away from all the fighting. They were just pointed towards civilian casualties. They filmed it. They didn't release it till they got out of Gaza a couple of days later, then released it. And it created a sensation at the time because up until that point, there'd been a war, but no footage of the actual fighting, only of the civilian casualties. So that's in my mind when I think about Israel blocking journalists from going in there now. But what's your view of it? And what do you think what kind of precedent or lessons do you think it might set for future conflicts? It's quite troubling as well. I mean, it's against my instinct to block journalists from anywhere.
Yeah, agreed. I kind of see both sides of the argument here, but obviously not on top of what you've said, there's also been direct threats against journalists if they publish stuff that Hamas don't like. And then, of course, if one of them gets too close or is escorted too close to something violent and the journalist gets killed, then that's always going to be turned back on Israel. So I totally get that. I think potentially, and actually I have a suspicion that a lot of negative reporting in this war has been almost like a fit of pique by journalists. And I ran into a journo on a flight back from Ukraine, and he almost said that verbatim.
Really?
Yeah, I won't tell you where he's from or which outlet. I'm not going to throw him under a bus, but pretty much he said that, like, they're not letting us in, so we're just not going to give him anything. Like, he was that blunt about it. And I wonder how widespread that attitude is. And also I've detected hints of that attitude amongst guys I know in Tel Aviv who are international journos. So I think that's part of it. But on top of that, we have the counterpoint, which is that perhaps they could have done more embeds. Like my first thing I did in Afghanistan out of training was Operation Palk or Hell, hammer blow. And we had a BBC journalist with us, and she wrote an article that actually, when it came out, my gut reaction was, I wish I'd been less nice to her. And now I read it, nearly 20 years later, and I'm like, actually, do you know what? That is actually a pretty good journalistic report. It's very balanced. And, while I was in the moment, I didn't like it, but actually in hindsight, pretty good. You can still go on the BBC website and look for Palk or Hell, and you can read all about my platoon running into the green zone over an infantry assault bridge. Embeds like that, I think, are useful. I mean, tricky to make the journalist safe. In Afghanistan, you could be a bound behind and know that you were safe. Gaza, where you've got a 720-degree threat, vertical to underground, all the way through that 360 on the horizontal, very tricky to keep someone safe. But perhaps they could have done more of those, and it might have just given an idea of the fighting. Even though Hamas have themselves released videos of fighting, the fact that there has actually been actual close quarter combat in Gaza hasn't really crept into world conversation at all. The IDF have had 3,000 casualties, 900 killed in action. In Afghanistan, we only had 452 killed.
Yeah.
They've had double that in Gaza in 2 years rather than 20. And yet, good luck finding that in international media discourse.
Yeah. And by comparison, as we were saying to Ahmed Al-Khatib, Hamas has killed almost 7,000 or about 7,000 Gazans since the ceasefire estimates are. So just compare those two figures, and nobody does. Okay. So operational level lessons, C2, command and control, logistics, fortification. Of those, the things, the bit that I found most interesting was the supply challenges for the IDF. Go ahead.
Which is bonkers given how short that logistic chain is. We're talking about fighting in Europe 1,000 miles away, if not more.
Yeah.
You could literally throw a tennis ball from the midpoint of Gaza to the fence with Israel. It's tiny, and yet there were real challenges. And I think this shows a lack of preparation. And I think the IDF themselves would tell you this. Like, they were caught on the hop. They didn't have enough bombs, bullets, body armor, helmets for 360,000 soldiers. There were charity campaigns all around the world to raise money to buy body armor for IDF soldiers. This is not an army that was good to go. I think preparation is the key to that lesson. And if we're looking at Eastern Europe for us, that preparation looks like forward mounting stores onto shipping. That you can have a floating resupply center, or it could be forward basing it in various European countries. It's about the preparation, and that's what the IDF got wrong and need to prepare for. There's also a sort of ad hoc, what we call an ORBAT, an order of battle, which means, you're a tank unit, but you've got a company of infantry attached out of nowhere. So they say, right, okay, you're with them, go. That's indicative of the fluid and kind of improvisation that's needed to operate in that fluid environment. But what it meant was that when you had an infantry unit attached to the tanks, the tank logistic chain was not prepared to resupply infantry. And so they'd be stealing and borrowing, kit from other units. And they made it work, but, one of the soldiers described it to me as a shambles, which is pretty damning, actually.
Yeah.
When you go days without food, not necessarily food, but, not enough food, or ammo is a trouble to get through, that's really difficult. And then, of course, there were ammunition shortages for the IDF. They just were not ready for a war of this scale.
Yeah, 90,000 shells in the first few weeks fired. Yeah,
exactly, which isn't unusual for a divisional, 3 divisional assault. Like 90,000 is quite a reasonable number of shells, actually. But the fact is they weren't ready for that. They were running out of bombs midway through the war. I went to 401 Brigade with Rafah in July 2024. They were running out of main tank armament shells. Shortages across the piece here. And it all comes back to that point about preparation, and then location of logistics, and then coordination of logistics.
Yeah.
And this isn't criticism. I think any army would struggle, but it's just a really good lesson for us to acknowledge that these things are difficult, and there are things we can do in advance of the war to make it easier when the inevitable friction and chaos of war kicks in.
And in terms of the number of munitions fired at Gaza, it's worth bearing in mind that 70% of the buildings were flattened, but 70% of the civilians weren't killed.
Yeah.
So the number of shells, the number of munitions in general, yes, it's a huge number, and yes, it's horrifying. People say 3 Pearl Harbors or 4 Hiroshimas, whatever they say. But the point is that if Israel hadn't evacuated civilians and had been seeking to conduct a genocide, they could have used those same munitions and wiped everyone out.
Oh, the death would be into the hundreds of thousands, which it isn't. But also, I think it's worth just drawing out that the number of strikes is vastly overstated on social media. It's nothing like X number of Hiroshimas. I did the maths on this actually just this week. I make it 68,500 targets struck. But bear in mind, a target could be anything from a 100-meter tunnel stretch to a small room in a house. And it could be any variation of munitions used to do those things. So the idea that you can come up with this number of saying 200,000 tons of TNT is nonsense. It's just not possible. On top of that, I think a lot of people don't realise that most of the damage in Gaza was done by ground manoeuvre, not by bombs dropping from the sky. That seems to be a really, really big misunderstanding I come across all the time on social media. The vast amount of damage is because every building was IED'd and the IDF have had to bulldoze their way through, and because tunnels underneath the ground have been blown up.
Yeah, and the only reason why ground manoeuvre was what the IDF relied upon was to save civilian casualties. If you didn't care about civilian casualties, if genocide was your goal, you wouldn't send a single soldier into harm's way. You just bomb them from the air.
Nor would you make a phone call, nor would you make text messages. And actually, amazingly, I was doing the research for this. I read a BBC article about this poor Gazan who was reduced to a state of terror because the IDF have called him and said, evacuate because you're going to attack the Hamas who live in your building. And apparently that was a bad thing that they did that. It's like, well, what's the alternative? You've got two. You either don't do anything, not an option, or you drop the bomb with all the civvies inside, which is clearly not acceptable. So, like,
damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Yeah, what else do you expect the IDF to do? You know, it's an incredible, there's an incredible disingenuous way of reporting this.
So, just before we move on from the resupply challenges, there's a vivid bit in your report where you talk about what the IDF were forced to do, which basically was resupplying under fire, and that's not ideal, is it?
It's not ideal, but it's realistic. You know, I think the idea that we're in Afghanistan, I mean, look, Op Loam was the resupply run from Camp Bastion all the way up through Goresh, working your way up the Helmand River Valley to Sangin to Musakala. You know, that came under fire quite regularly. I was working with the American Special Forces, and one of our jobs was to sit on the high ground on a fairly vulnerable valley, which would be a really good ambush point, just to make sure that Op Loam could get through and resupply all our bases. So it's not unusual to think of logistics as a combat move. But the IDF came up with a really good phrase, and that is they treat logistic resupply, every single one, as an advance to contact, which is army terminology for where you go forward knowing that you're going to be shot at, but you don't know where. So you do it in the infantry. You know, you're going over open ground, you're patrolling forward, someone shoots, there's your contact. That's an advance to contact. The IDF had the same principle, but with logistic resupply. They knew they were going to be shot at some point, and they knew they would have to fight through that to get the logistics through. But they did it well enough that actually their log chain, the logistics chain, was actually relatively unmolested throughout the war. They didn't get a huge number of ambushes, which just shows you that they did it right. They did it well.
Which sort of leads us on to talking about intel and special forces. Maybe we can treat those two things together. So on the intel side, you know, traditionally you talk about HUMINT and SIGINT, human intelligence and signals intelligence, the former being a person, the latter being some kind of surveillance, I guess, broadly speaking. Now, Yossi Cohen, the former Mossad chief who we've had on this podcast fairly recently, in his book talks about HUGINT, combination between human intelligence and signals intelligence in one, which he used or pioneered in the Mossad. Tell me about the intelligence lessons from Gaza, and then we'll move on to special forces. If you've been enjoying the conversation so far, don't panic. To catch the rest of the episode, just head over to our Substack at thebrinkpodcast.co.uk.